Here. Thanks very much for the opportunity to make this presentation. I should just briefly introduce myself. Those of you who haven't either read my articles or seen me do presentations before. My name is Jeff Trickey. I'm the CEO at Psychological Consultancy Limited. We're a team of business psychologists that have got somehow involved in the risk territory. And so we've been bringing applied psychology dimension to the development of business solutions for the last 30 years, believe it or not. Research into the human factor side of risk and the development of the risk type compass, that's a psychometric tool, has taken us into the banking and financial sector, as well as into health and safety increasingly over recent years. So just a brief comment on the risk type compass. It is a tool which differentiates, it's a personality assessment basically, but a tool that differentiates everybody into one of 8 risk types or characterizes you as axial, where you're kind of independent or neutral in relation to risk types. And these dispositions sort of interact, if you like, with your decision making and influence the way you think, both consciously and subconsciously. Okay, I want to start off with just a brief story, which I think encapsulates the particular direction I want to take today. In the past, I've very often started off with what is the risk type compass, how did it happen, what are its statistics, what was the research, and so on. But I want to come at it from a slightly different point of view this time. So I'm going to just run this. This is actually a personal experience. So when I was a young boy in London, in the London secondary school, we had a scout troop, and it was a Sea Scout troop. We were the 5th Maribon troop of scouts, and when we went camping, because we were Sea Scouts, we took a boat with us. And on this particular occasion, we were in Essex on the River Blackwater, and 3 of us, Sandy and Jack and myself, teenage kids, we were about to set out on a mission, which involved us having to stay in a boat, in a small boat, for 24 hours. And the boat was a bit like the one on the screen, but a bit shorter, I would say. No rudder, notice, just oars, no actual sail. So we're taking this small taking this small boat. It's a very tight fit with our supplies, just a pair of oars. We've got a tarpaulin in case it rains, something to cover us. And Mr. Skull, who is the chemistry teacher at the school and the scoutmaster, waved goodbye as we pushed off into the Blackwater in high spirits. Distance out into the river, we were soon making pathetic attempts to arrange a sail, hoping that the tarpaulin would save us some rowing by contributing a bit of wind power. And the frustration, though, of that, having made a glorious mess of sail rigging, was nothing compared to the realization that now we had drifted a long way. We were in the center of a very wide river and moving quickly, and the ebbing tidal waters of the Blackwater were sweeping us all along at an increasing speed. So the dots here, you can see the rambling arounds, and then we get caught up in the current. This is a scary situation. So disorder deteriorates into mayhem and panic and desperation. We're arguing, we're fighting, we're swearing at each other, and driven by fear, we're frantically rowing as fast as we're able, sometimes singly or trying 2 of us at once. But then we're falling over the baggage, which is in the small boat. So it's a complete shambles. And we are helplessly losing the battle. We're going backwards and fast. So we're kind of trying to row against the stream, trying to get back to where we came from, but going backwards. And on top of that, it's now raining. Okay, then Sandy has a light bulb moment. He just grasps what's going on here and is calm enough to unravel the situation. What we need to do, he says, is get out of the center stream because the current is stronger, and we need to get to the slower, shallower waters, nearer to the bank where the drag slows down the flow of the water. And so instead of now pointing directly back where we were coming from and staying center stream, we are now changing direction. We moved gradually towards the shore, and bit by bit, we begin to make some progress and eventually get to the beach, which is all shingle, and we drag the boat up out of above the waterline, and drained, wet and bedraggled. The failure to complete our 24-hour session actually couldn't have felt any sweeter. So the point here is, what I'm trying to get at is the forces of nature. If you're dealing with something like that, if you're caught up in that sort of situation, not necessarily on boats, could be in any extreme situation, the power of nature is overwhelming, and not understanding what's going on is a terrifying kind of experience. So no amount of creative, in that situation, without the insight about what's happening, what's driving the events that you're involved in, no amount of creative thinking, physical effort, collaboration, desire, initiative are going to solve the problem. It's not possible. So that's the theme I want to take in this. I want to talk about largely the undercurrents of decision making. So risks require decisions to be made, and decisions always have a risk dimension. So what I'd say is tomorrows are formed in the crucible of today's decisions. And the way we make decisions generally in organizations, no, not generally, very often in organizations, is a group process. So in boards, working parties, committees, all of these configurations listed on the left, right through to football teams. Football teams are making goodness knows how many decisions a day for every match. Pandemic managers, of course, to bring the experience, to make it contextual in relation to recent events. But everybody knows that group decision making is problematic. And on the right, you have there some suggested ideas, some of the most prominent strategies that sometimes get adopted in order to try and moderate that situation, to get the best out of the board, to make the best of the talents, to get everybody contributing, and to get an appreciation of what alternatives there might be, how many different solutions there might be that could be considered. So the nominal group technique is one where you break the group down into groups and so on. They go through a particular process and ultimately they all vote. So everybody has to have a say in that process. I'll leave out the middle ones, but the red teaming one's current somewhat because that's derived from the Korean War, in fact, where people who were making strategy decisions on the ground in jungle conditions would have somebody allocated as the red view, as it were, as the person who would look at it all from the enemy's point of view and try to see how they might exploit that tactic if that was adopted. Okay, so with normal decision making in groups, there's an awful lot going on, isn't there, underneath the surface? So these things are on the left here, all the feelings, the values, the opinions, the allegiances, sensitivities, and so on. And above all, beneath all of that, are the individual propensities for risk-taking, which my argument is are a major, major factor in this undercurrents of decision-making. So in group decision-making, what happens at the surface is always subject to powerful undercurrents, and the biggest of those, the most significant of those, but beyond that, something that we can grapple with and deal with because we know something about what we're dealing with here. But the most important factor is the risk dispositions of the group members. Now, the term dispositions, I want to unpack just a little bit. I mean, we're personality psychologists, so we use that word to describe the impact of somebody's personality characteristics. So if you are an extrovert, then that disposition has a continuing impact on your propensity for doing things. Doesn't mean to say you're extrovert all the time, doesn't mean to say you can't moderate that and control it, but that's what we mean by disposition. It's sitting there, as it were, lurking, hoping and driving and offering that option of behavior or that influence. While we're on the subject of personality, personality these days is viewed as through a 5-factor lens. I mean, this is, I suppose, the consensus about what personality is all about. It's very much influenced by what you can measure. And the 5 factors are extroversion, neuroticism, agreeability, openness, and conscientiousness. And that all adds up to phenotype. Because those things are measured on the basis of the vocabulary we use to describe each other, and vocabulary itself is phenotypic. I mean, when you choose words to describe somebody else, you're describing what you see, what you observe. In fact, you're observing a phenotype. So that's the basis of personality. Where the beginnings of our work started when we looked into that territory and identified those elements within that 5-factor model which were concerned with the survival and decision making and risk. And the result of that was a 4-factor model, which became the risk type compass. Okay. Now, I want to just comment here about dualism. Dualism is a way of thinking about the people, and it's a philosophical style, if you like, and it's very complicated because there are many strands to it. But it goes back as far as Plato. So it's going a long time. And Plato, who describes the 2 aspects of emotion and cognition and reason as pulling people in different directions, like 2 horses pulling in opposite directions. And then Descartes, I think, therefore I am person, differentiates your nature, your animal instincts, your intuitions and emotions, the way you react naturally, what your natural responses, your fears and your appetites, that all separates from reason, logic, and informed, considered, planned, knowledge-based, aware, conscious experience. So that's the 2 sort of factors that permeate dualism. And you are aware of these because, in fact, in just about every decision that you make, you'll feel the operation of them. So even if you're, for example, you're going to go and buy something, maybe your dream car, and finally you've got the money and you want to do it. But on the other hand, your brain is kicking in with, yeah, but I want it. I desperately want it. But is it sensible? Is it rational? How fast will it depreciate? Or on the other hand, in terms of whether or not to eat something, I want a delicious cake. I desire it. That's my basic impulse is to eat the cake. But then I think, if I do that, then what about my diet? What about my health, and so on and so on? And then on to when you befriend somebody who don't befriend them. You've always got these 2 things going. You've got your emotional, your desires, your interests, what you want to accomplish. And on the other hand, you've got another voice which is saying, shouldn't do that. That's too much of this. It's too much of the other, and so on. So you've got this kind of tension within personal experience, when that's reflected also in the physiology, in our physiology. This is a quote from Mark Walport. He was the former government chief scientific advisor, and his annual report was entitled Innovation, Managing Risk, Not Avoid It. And it's his statement within that, as a sort of a framework for taking on that issue, is that decision-making draws on both analytical and emotional systems in the brain. So that's what's happening when you purchase, when you make decisions, and on a day-to-day basis. Also, it exemplifies the physiological aspects of cognition and emotion. So these 2 forces within us that seem to be pulling in different directions at times are very, very deeply rooted. The emotion part of it is associated with the, very early development. I mean, that goes back almost to the beginning of a life, that aspect of it, because it is crucially about survival. And that part of the brain, the hind brain, an old part of the brain, has developed in a way that takes care of us. It nurses us through life, and has nursed us through life, all of us. looking back at our genealogy, which all goes back to the same beginnings. So that aspect of our nature has looked after us all of that time. So it's been in charge, if you like, then for maybe 1 billion years. And it looked after your blood pressure, your oxygen levels, it monitored your hunger and your thirst, made sure you went to look for food and drink, and it moderates your fight and flight responses, after the energy levels and so on. And that's all operated then in the older parts of the brain. And I know this is obviously a very complicated area, and very broadly and oversimplifying it, the amygdala and the limbic system are crucially tied up with all of that unconscious processing. Yeah, that goes back to the simplest kind of animal forms. On the other hand, the cognitive bit is in the newest part of the brain, in the frontal lobe and in the prefrontal cortex in particular. And that's all concerned with planning and decision making, and it kind of moderates the emotional impulses. So now you've got these two sides, if you like, acting within you, one of which is the feelings and the desires coming from the emotion. And then you've got the cognition, which is trying to moderate that and make decisions and plan on the basis of the knowledge, the information, and the kind of strategizing capabilities that live in that part of you. Okay, so what we've got here then is two very separate and independent systems in your brain. They're separated by billions of evolutionary years. They've developed quite independent of one another. And you get this kind of who's in charge antagonism. And this is something that Antonio Damasio mentions and refers to. And he's a neurologist, neuroscientist, I guess, and a very interesting book called Descartes' Error, which is very, very widely read. But you've got this antagonism between what was used to be in charge, emotions, impulses, and what is now in charge, which is your more rational, cognitive end of the spectrum. And there's zero correlation between these two risk dispositions. They're quite separate. Well, obviously they ultimately integrate because you behave as a result of the way this plays out, but they are separate sets of dispositions, and they maximize individual variability. I mean, arguably the success of our species is due to the fact that we have this huge variation in the way that we deal with problems and we deal with issues. The balance between our emotions and our cognitions varies incredibly. No other species has that. Many other species have the emotional side of it, or something that developed along that phylogenetic pathway, but none has the cognition at the level that we have it as a species today. So our cognitive abilities differentiate us, the advanced, the aspects of our brain that it's working at its best, at its most functional, compared to the most advanced primates, is a massive distinction. So we have every possible combination because they're separate. If they were linked together, if you see what I mean, you would only have one line and everybody would have something similar. But no, we are very different from each other in this respect because of the independence of our thinking from our feeling. They're quite separated. So it's quite possible for you to be risk-taking in terms of emotion, but not at all risk-taking in terms of cognition. So this picture now is kind of, I suppose, the ground plan or the foundation for the risk-type compass. And those four terms, intense, prudent, carefree, and composed, are the factors which we extracted out of the material from the broader personality assessments. And the way they work is that those two scales, they're each, one's an emotion scale, which is intense at one end and composed at the other. So if you were to take the questions related to emotion, if we assessed you psychologically on that scale, you would have to, everybody would come between one end and the other of the scale. The most intense would be the most emotional, would be the most reactive, would be the most the people who were very alert to risk and danger and so on. And at the other end, you've got people who are almost oblivious to risk. They're just calm. It's very hard to make them excited or emotional. So that's the emotional scale. In the middle, of course, you're neutral. You're neither all intense or on the other hand, all composed, but you're somewhere neutral in the middle. On the other scale, so the bipolar scales, at the other scale, the cognition scale, everybody falls somewhere between being prudent and being carefree. Prudent are people who want to be organized and systematic. They're uncomfortable with uncertainty, and ambiguity worries them. They like to know exactly what they're in for, exactly what they're doing, what's the process, what should you do, what's the right way to do whatever you're doing. That's at one end. At the other end, the carefree type are not troubled by uncertainty at all. Uncertainty to them is opportunity. It's kind of, wow, this is exciting. They love the excitement of it. They love to, they get energized by uncertainty, whereas the prudent people would be disconcerted by it. So those two bipolar scales then, the emotion is visceral, it's actually physical. In many conditions, if you're a very anxious person, you will react physically to loud noises or to some uncertain noise in the night or whatever. So that's the emotion side of it. It's automatic, it's quick, it happens immediately as a response, and it's very prone to error for that reason. Cognition, on the other hand, is mental, it's conscious, it's controlled, and it's unemotional. So on that scale, on the cognition scale, yes, we go from the prudent to the carefree. So that's kind of the foundation. The further out you are to the ends of those scales, then the more typically those labels would apply to you. Now, the issue here is that if you have two scales like that, if they're orthogonal, in sort of factor analytic terms, it's fine to place them at, I mean, orthogonal actually means at right angles as well. So it's fine to arrange them at right angles because actually they can't see each other, if you see what I mean. But you've got the situation where someone can be both intense and prudent. So you've got to account for what goes on between the lines, as it were. So if these were our two basic scales, then you've got to reckon that in between those, you can sort of increment that through 360 degrees. And that's what we do in the wrist type compass. The wrist type compass is a 360-degree space within which you will be placed somewhere. You will be placed there because you will fall somewhere on both of those scales. Nobody doesn't. No one falls outside that range. And the in-between ones then, the wary types, are the interaction between prudent and intense. And the deliberate type are the interaction between prudent and composed, and so on. These intervening quadrants then they're more than, they're not just a mirror of those two things, because there's a chemistry between the neighboring risk types which creates those intervening risk types. And if you're in the axis, well, then you're neutral in relation to any of the risk types, which has its own particular benefits and disadvantages. But one of the big benefits is you are the person who has the most objective perception of those around you, who will vary dramatically. So in the middle then, that's where the signal, if you like, is weak. So that position would be somebody who is prudent, but not extremely so. And as you move to the edge, you reach the people who are extremely prudent. Okay, now this graphic shows you something. I'm not sure how many, something like 25,000 people in this. Then this was an amazing finding for us, because it was not expected. If you take the Myers-Briggs, for example, that's a typology. And because it's typology, you can divide up and obviously see what percentages there are of each risk type, and they vary quite dramatically. The significant thing about this graphic is it shows that there's a broad similarity. I mean, that graphic is geometrically correct, but you can see there are a smaller number of the intense, and I think the biggest group is the deliberate on the other side. So, but nevertheless, there's a very broadly even distribution of the different types on the risk type compass. if you like, that's why we call that team Homo sapiens. You know, this is the implication would be that none of those risk types is better or worse than any of the others. No one dominates it. Whatever risk type you are, there are plenty more of you in the same sort of position. So it's not a right and wrong thing. It's a recognition that we have this variety, and these people have different ways in which they will tend to make decisions, different undercurrents, if you like, of risk personality, which will push them in a certain direction. So you can see then, once you know this, the advantages perhaps of looking at having a decent balance, or at least being aware to what extent your group of people are all clustered in one corner at one side of the compass. And from your own point of view, it's vital that you understand where you are, and particularly if you're in risk management, if you're contributing to discussions and strategy developments around risk and uncertainty, then it's quite useful to know whether or not you're an extreme wary type or if you're an extreme adventurous type. It makes a difference. Okay, so just to add some meaning to that, rather than just talk categories and numbers, I'm going to just first of all look at the opposite ends of the emotion scale. So, and this little bit of vocabulary here, well, how many words are there? 6, are there 6, 7? Is small. There's a huge vocabulary that you can feed into that. And the way that we do that, the way that we expand that is as the basis of research. So we do huge amounts of research, finding different groups of different kinds and learning from them what they would understand and appreciate and recognize as being their kind of disposition. So it's based on that kind of research. So intense people then we would describe as anxious, expressive, vigilant, self-critical, urgent, and insecure. If you're very intense, then life is difficult for you. It's because the anxieties are so difficult to reassure about things, especially when you're young, life is tough. Now, the opposite end of that are people, the composed group. They are imperturbable, calm, unreactive, even-tempered, and they appear self-assured. They look self-assured because when everybody else is running around like headless chickens in a crisis, they're not. So they seem to know what they're doing, and it's very positive to have very composed people in any crisis situation because it helps just lower the temperature. The other scale then is one in prudent. We talked about that. So that's being systematic, literal, compliant, orderly, detailed, and seeking permission. Prudent people like to have justification from what they're doing, either from permission or from qualifications. If you're prudent, the likelihood is you'll have lots of certificates in risk management, or you won't do things without somebody else saying, yeah, that's okay, you do that. The carefree type, on the other hand, are independent. They're not looking for permission. They're glad to be free of any restraint. They're curious, they're imaginative, so they're opportunistic. They look for the positive side of situations. What are the opportunities that are going to arise? And in general, they're more easygoing and relaxed. Okay, so those are the 4 originals. Now, what happens in between those then is the chemistry between the neighboring risk types. So, sorry, I've done 2 of that. So wary then, the wary risk type, that's the chemistry between being prudent and intense. So these people are driven. Now, think being very organized and systematic and then turbo boosting that with emotion. And you've got something like wary, or the other way around. Think of someone being very anxious and then adding into that being prudent and organized and systematic, and you'll get a feel for what a wary type is. A wary type is driven, they're passionate, they're very expressive, they're campaigning, they've got a mission, which is the emotion driving the organization side of them. They're influencing, they're astute, and they seek to control the situation, largely because they don't trust anybody else, and they are anxious, so they want a result. Between the prudent and composed, the deliberate risk type, these are people who are completely consistent. I shouldn't say completely, they're consistent. They're stable, they're very reliable, they're methodical, but they're inexpressive. They don't express urgency or excitement or enthusiasm easily. and the adventurous risk type, then now these people have got two reasons why they are risk taking. In the first place, they are imperturbable and calm, so they don't notice risk, they don't read risk, they don't see the risk, and they're also carefree, so they're also curious. So they're risk taking from an emotional point of view and from a cognitive point of view. So they're curious, imaginative, opportunistic, easygoing. No, I'm sorry, reading the wrong line. Opportunistic, confident, open-minded, enterprising, and importantly, they're rash. That's the sort of person that drops out of a helicopter into the middle of the jungle with the cheese sandwiches and says, come back for me in 6 months' time. That actually happens, doesn't it? So, and finally then, just to do that juggling around, because remember this is a circle, so to get carefree and intense next to each other, the excitable risk type, these people are creative, they're flexible, they're purposeful and insistent and demonstrative. Our research suggests that the excitable risk type is where a lot of creative people lie. I won't go into the detail of that, but all of this sort of comment is really well supported by the ongoing research that we are continually carrying out here at PCL. Now look, these are sort of we call fingerprints, but they're shows you what some different professions, what the balance of the different risk types are. And the big point I'm making here is look how varied they are. Look how, for example, traffic controllers, they're the most extreme example because their traffic controllers are 75% deliberate people. And even the ones that are not deliberate are prudent or composed. So that's the neighboring grouping. And everything else is reduced to a sliver. And then auditors are a bit like that and so on. And legal profession, very wary and cautious. And you can see for yourself. I mean, I'm not going into that in detail, but the point I'm making is that these are the sort of context, the decision-making, the group decision-making within these different institutions. And the bias that, or the influence that might have. Now, I want to just give a couple of examples of how I see the influence of undercurrents playing out and demonstrating the reality of what I'm saying. I take this as sort of reassurance, if you like. The first of all is banking deregulation. I mean, prior to deregulation, which is now some time ago, isn't it? But so not everybody will be aware what the world was like then. But retail banking at that point was definitely exemplified by the high street bank and the persona of the local bank manager. Everybody in that neighborhood would be associated with one bank or another. I mean, for one thing, the banks had sort of antennae going into communities all over the country. I don't know how many high street banks there must have been, but there must have been a huge number. And those banks were the people they were the go-to people if you wanted to borrow some money. I remember when I was still on a student loan, going to my bank manager and saying, I've seen a fabulous Morgan three-wheeler car with a beautiful engine stuck on the front, and I was really in love with it. It was red. And he was very, very long-suffering, but the answer obviously was no. He just worked out I wasn't going to have the wherewithal to pay the money back. So that was the nature. I was encapsulates a little bit what banking was like. That was the nature of retail banking. Now, after deregulation, retail banks took over the investment banks, and obviously investment bankers have got a very different disposition. I mean, the undercurrents in investment banking are nothing like the undercurrents that existed in the high street bank. And their approach to risk, though, transformed banking culture and the business models which bankers used. I mean, rather, you try and go to your local bank now and find a bank manager to discuss your personal problems with. I'm sorry, you won't find one. So the reliance on personal experience and the intuition that those bank managers would have accumulated over a lifetime, I guess, or a career, was replaced by modeling and probabilistic risk-taking and so on, as we all know. And I just add in for good measure Plato, because we talked about him before, so it's worth quoting again. Good decision is based on knowledge and not on numbers. Well, obviously, we can go into that debate a lot. But anyway, let me bring this as my sort of summary page for this kind of influence. You've got here For most, I'll just elaborate a little bit for anybody who's not from the UK, but Dad's Army is a very popular sitcom back in the 60s and 70s. And the man in the middle is Captain Mannering. It's actually Arthur Lowe, the actor, but Captain Mannering is the head of this group of Home Guard people. In the Second World War, we had Home Guards. We had people who were too old to be called up, but they wanted to serve their communities, and they would join the Home Guard. And these people would come around to make sure that your blackout was complete at night. That was the most usual contact you'd have with them. But they were there as a last-ditch stand, supposedly. So it's quite an amusing program. But anyway, he is the center of that program. But the important thing about him is his nature and his character. So he's quite limited. He's very dependable, reliable, steady, conservative, do things by the book kind of a person. And the people around are some of those people who, as a result of what happened in banking, have had a negative effect to some degree. So it's opening up banking to people with very different ambitions and attitudes towards risk. And just going around, I mean, I've added up, these people have all lost huge amounts of money for the institutions they worked for, and destroyed the institutions in some cases, or put them into public ownership. So you've got bottom left, you've got Fred Goodwin, it's the Bank of Scotland. I won't go into the detail of their misdemeanors, if that's what we would characterize them at. You've got Nick Leeson, who destroyed Barings Bank, which was one of the oldest banks, well, hundreds of years old. You've got Jeff Skilling at the top, who was at Enron. You've got Bob Diamond, who is slightly different kettle of fish, really, but nevertheless has, without doubt, the kind of temperament that is very effective as an investor and in investment banking. And then you've got Richard Fuld of Lehman Brothers. And between them, I don't want to label anybody with what they owe the world, but it comes to something like 150 billion pounds between them. That's like 15 and 10 zeros after it. That is a huge amount of money. And so whether that's a good illustration or not, that's the kind of certainly underlines the point I'm making. The nature of the people influence the undercurrents and the decision making that goes on and the way things go. Not always in a negative way, obviously. Okay. So the second example I want to talk about is a bit more kind of serious and very science, I suppose, related. So the Wolves of Wall Street study was something that was published in 2016, and it's also been published, they published subsequent papers. It was a group from America, Europe, and the UK that were undertaking that research. And they accumulated a huge amount of data on bank managers and on banks. And on the basis of that, what they tried to do was to find out what aspects, what were the things that determined the kind of business strategy of a bank. What made it a bank that took a lot of risks? What made it a bank that was very conservative and traditional? What were the influences? And so they had a very broad range of data and information that they looked at in order to, first of all, decide which banks were the most risk-taking. So they looked at these variables on the left, holding of liquid assets, reliance on interest income, and so on, down to compensation and incentives. And compensation incentives, at the time that this was published, this was just sort of around the time of the banking crisis, the word on the block was that compensation incentives was just encouraging greedy bankers to take more and more risks. So that would be part of this agenda. They also looked at the banks then, how much risk are the banks taking? And then they looked at the demographics of the bankers involved. So they looked at their education and what had happened in the build up to their employment in the bank. Did they do an MBA or not? Had they been to university? Which kinds of university? Did they go to Ivy League universities? Also looked at career history, fast tracking, non-banking experience, whether they were in the military ever, what was their professional training, and so on. I mean, these are summaries. If you read the paper, there are tables and tables of the data they collected, and it was very considerable and extremely thorough. And it is still producing results, seemingly, because a a more recent version of Wall Street was published about a year ago, I think. So the business models that they identified, they're at the bottom right. So they characterized bank on the basis of the bank policy choices. They characterized them as extremely prudent, cautious traditionalists, aggressive traditionalists, cautious innovators, or aggressive innovators. So that was their framework, and that came from the data that they had on the banks. And this is the way that is portrayed within the study. It's the clustering of bank manager styles, they describe that as. So the bank managers that are the most innovative are near at the top, the ones that are the most traditional are to the right. And you can see there those different categories and the way they cluster together. So another summary of the outcome in this graphic again looks at the variance in, excuse me, it looks at the variance in the business model preferences of the banks, as already described. And it looks at, first of all, then compensation. So compensation, as you can see, has a very little influence on the business models in this data. So this is, can I just go back a minute? Because I'm not sure I emphasized enough. Can I just go back to this? Look, 1,578 bank managers and 165 different banks. And the next point, tracking as they move from bank to bank. It was a connected sample, and every participating bank had people who had moved from it to one of the other banks in the sample. That's an important factor to remember. So what they were able to show then is compensation had very little impact on the business models. Neither did other manager attributes, whatever university they went, whatever they're fast track, not fast track, been in the army, not been in the army, had very little to do with the impact on the business model. They had added a number of controls into the equation for various reasons to do with the size of the bank and various financial metrics. But even so, adding those in takes the number, well, that's about, what's it, about 32, something like that. But the big one is this. This is the X factor, they describe it as. In fact, it's the one factor that seemingly is not listed in the things that they were investigating. It was like the black hole in the middle of it all, if that's a fair way of putting it. So this is like 72% of the variance in the business models is attributed to this X factor. And we'll look at what the X factor might be in a minute. And so that's nearly, apart from adding in the compensations and the controls, putting it all together, is clearly the most dominant factor. So what is the X factor? All right, well, the X factor, this is the language they use in the research. They don't know what the X factor is. There's an interview which may still be available with the Financial Times at the time. At the point in 2016-17, this was a really hot finding, and the Financial Times ran a big piece on it, and they also conducted an interview with the researchers. And the question was, what was the X factor? And what they had to say about that, they thought it was to do with personality, to do with risk style. And this is the terminology they use. I mean, the formal way of terming it is manager fixed effects. So it's what the managers took with them in whatever environment they are, whichever bank that they worked in is what they took with them. So it's their personality. They refer to it as time invariant management characteristics, personal risk preferences, idiosyncratic manager preferences, and so on, and latent characteristics. As far as I'm concerned, this is risk disposition. And then in my mind, there's no question about that. But we are looking at this now, and we will be contributing to that research program with the risk diet compass to see if that is the case, or to confirm that is the case. Okay. So that sort of covers the territory I wanted to cover in the session. So what are the conclusions? I mean, broadly speaking, what I would say about my observations of the risk world is that it neglects human factors in their drive to tame uncertainty. So they're forever looking at the risk horizon, saying, oh my goodness, what's coming now? What's next? And rather than thinking, who's making the decisions here? And having just gone through COVID, didn't you want to know who was behind closed doors that decided when we should do this, when we should do that, whether vaccination should be compulsory, whether we would lock down, would children stay at home, should children have I mean, surely we need to know what the risk dispositions of those people was. That would have been, I think, quite a useful insight into what was going on, and perhaps a moderating factor. But we tend to ignore the human factors because we're worried about the uncertainties. And we're talking hypothetical risk versus inherent risk. We can measure. I mean, the risk dispositions of the people making those decisions are inherent. They're there and they're measurable to a very substantial degree and reliably measurable. So we should be focusing, I'm arguing, on the who as well as the what. Sure, we need to worry about other things, but let's just get it right. Who's making the decisions is the number one consideration. So we need to maximize our diversity. That's how nature survives. Nature survives by maximizing the diversity in species, so that there's always something that survives, despite the explosions or the meteor or the destroyed the dinosaurs. There's plenty of life left, and it carries on. So you minimize the diversity at your own. I've lost the word. You minimize diversity at your own cost. Put it that way, at your own risk. That's probably the word. So finally, then going back to Francis Bacon, a philosopher and a scientist, a mathematician. Nature, to be commanded, must first be obeyed. So that means if you don't take care of human nature, then you're in for trouble. Okay, anyways, that's the end of the presentation. I think I haven't any more to say on that, except one more thing. Just say, when you can measure it, you can manage it. That's a well-known saying within the world of business. So at a personal level, understanding your own risk dispositions is important. You want to know what the implications of them are and how it's affecting your life. If you look back over your life, your risk dispositions have been playing a part. You have made decisions which change the course and direction of what you did, and which are to do with your risk dispositions. At a team level, risk team dynamics, going back to the undercurrents, are very considerable. What's going on underneath the table, as it were, with the undercurrents of people's risk dispositions are important, and they're a good basis for team audit and for team development. We use it in those ways. And finally, at an organizational level, mapping the risk landscape provides unprecedented possibilities for effective deployment of people, and making use of the fact that you need diversity in teams, that you want contrary points of view, and that you've got a problem where you haven't. And if you can see where and who is where in the organization, which you can using the risk landscape, you've got a basis for beginning to manage it in a way that is optimizes. It allows you to try things to see, is this better? Do we get better results from this or from that? And you can ensure that you've got the kind of diversity from the point of view of whatever other kinds of diversity. But you've also got diversity, there's cognitive diversity, if you like, or diversity of risk dispositions, and that will help with effective deployment of your staff, maximize their contribution and their development, and it helps with strategic planning. So there you go. So I'm just going to say that beware the undercurrents. So either from within or from within the group dynamics. And if you want to complete the Risk Type Compass and get a one-page report, you can do so if you look at the instructions on your left. So you need to go to www.sci-key.com, enter the access code RAW 2022, register details, begin the assessment, and you'll get a one-page report. It'll tell you your risk type, and it'll give you a little explanation about it as well, but not in great detail. But you can upgrade that if you wanted to a full personal report. Okay, well, thanks very much for your attention this morning. It's been a delight to talk to you. I very look forward to any questions that anybody.
Thank you. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you so much. Very interesting presentation. And we do have some questions. So let me start with the first one. Firiadi is asking about a risk avoidance index and how that could differ, not just on the kind of based on the profession, but also based on the history and the cultural differences and the geographical differences. Basically, some countries went through a lot, so they may be more risk averse than neighboring countries. What was your experience in the kind of in the cultural, geographical impact on the risk attitude?
Okay. Well, what I would say is that with risk and decision making, in my view, and I think I can justify this in a number of ways, but in my view, you're tapping into something which is much clearer, closer to genotype than so you're getting to something that's quite deeply rooted within people. That's the only way I can explain the normality of the distribution of these measures and the remarkable reliability of them. They're obviously doing something that normal personality doesn't do. It's getting to something. And going back to personality, we know that personality, that broad model holds up remarkably well. I mean, the development of the 5-factor model happened about, 20, 30 years ago, but it happened largely in America, who are very big on psychometrics when other countries were not. And they have researched it all over the world, and that model is being used all over the world now. So I take the point, really, obviously, events are very important. Somebody who's been traumatized is going to have a different disposition towards risk than they had before they were traumatized. And maybe they won't get out. The length of their recovery might also depend on their risk type and so on. But that gets very complicated at that point. So no one's saying it's absolute in that way. It's not, what I would say is the important thing is about self-awareness anyway. It's about recognizing what you are and seeing that in your own experience on a day-to-day basis, and your reputation with the colleagues that you have. Your partner or close friends will tell you what you like, even if you've got illusions about yourself. And so the two things are playing hand in hand. I think the one point I'd add to that is so generally I would say I would expect it to work, put it that way. We know, for example, personality assessment that are translated from English and American and an operation in China are proving to be very effective. So that's some sort of indication, if you like, about it. Okay, is that enough?
Yes, thank you very much. The follow-up question. High, and this is a hypothesis, so just share your thoughts on what you hear. High individualism and low risk avoidance index mixture will let the individuals thrive. What are your thoughts on that? On the importance of this
high individualism and
low risk avoidance.
Low risk avoidance. Well, I say the high individualism. What's individualism? Individualism, I suppose, is being, in our terms, would be the strongest of the risk types. They're the most distinctive in what they were. The low risk takers could be. I mean, this is an issue. People always talk about risk disposition like it's one thing. It isn't. It's two things. It's because you can be risk averse in entirely different ways. So if you're risk averse from an emotional point of view, that's very different from being risk averse from a cognitive point of view. The first of those means you're fearful, you're anxious, you're on a trigger wire, is that a phrase? But you react very easily to things. You're very perceptive and reactive. Being emotionally risk averse means it's just uncertainty that you're worried about. You dislike not knowing what you're doing, what you're going into, and what's likely to occur. So they're very different kind of things. I mean, I suppose the general answer, I'm not saying in these sorts of questions you can ultimately resolve by finding a sample of people from whatever neighborhood in various circumstances. And that's what we look to do. So the gradual improvement of our interpretation, our understanding of risk type has developed on the back of those sorts of studies. So when I say that someone who's carefree or excitable is likely to be creative, that's because we ran a research study with a number of major creative institutions in London, like the London School of Fashion, like Smartens School of Art, and we worked with the person who's responsible for about 5 of those institutions. And the sample were, by definition, creative, and a disproportionate number of them end up in the excitable category, which makes sense. I mean, the excitable category is almost a perfect characterization of what we consider an artistic temperament. It's someone who gets excited, they're novel, they want to do something original and so on, but they're very anxious. And that's kind of, I suppose, your Van Goghs or your Gauguins, or your sort of stereotypic artistic temperament.
Do you find risk dispositions, and if I understand correctly, risk dispositions is your name for basically like risk attitudes? And do you find that risk dispositions are relatively consistent, or do they change based on weather, hungry, happy? Like, do they change based on the circumstances around at the particular point of making a decision?
Yeah, I mean, things happen in any circumstance, in any situation. What happens is up for grabs, I suppose, from various impacts and various situational and contextual factors. But what we find is, in terms of the measurement, we can't do longitudinal study yet because we haven't. The risk type compass is about 10 years old. But we can, out of that, we can segment the age of the people who have taken the questionnaires. And those two underlying scales are remarkably stable over time. They do have a slight trend, and that's what you'd expect from knowledge of what happens to personality as people get older. So the most anxious people get slightly less anxious as they get older. They wear themselves out with their anxiety and the challenges they face in life. And as they get older, they get more comfortable in their own skin, they get calmer. The opposite happens in a way with the cognitive side of things, because in later life, you get more anxious. I mean, you're sort of cognitively anxious. I can tell you, if you're not careful, you fall downstairs. So, so experience obviously is in the mix, isn't it? Quite evidently. But the intriguing thing is looking back over time and just how predictable people are. So if you look on our website, there's a study there of 3 guys who jumped out of for charity reasons and as a bet and a dare to each other. They went and did a skydive. And it's quite funny because it's so predictable. One of them was the husband whose wife worked for us at PCL, and 2 of his friends. But these sorts of things I think if you I would recommend you take the opportunity to find out your risk type, because it costs you nothing just to do that. But just think about your life. Think of the decisions you've made and whether that actually fits, because it remarkably does very often. And also the other thing I would say added to that, if you really want to know what you're like, then you're not the best judge. The best judge is to get your partner to read the report, and they may say, "Oh, yes, you are." No, I would never do that. Well, I think you would. So that's the way. But yeah, generally speaking, on the global scale, clearly you have to demonstrate its utility. It has to, translating these things is very difficult. We have a Chinese version on the stocks at the moment. And the business of translating everything into 2 kinds of Chinese, making sure it's colloquial, making sure it's psychometrically accurate in the way that the English version is a big headache. And it's taken us almost 2 years to get to a point where we're just about on the verge of launching that.
Thank you very much. The only other question we had was the second study. If you can find, if you help.
Yeah.
What was the name of it so the people can find it?
It's called The Wolves of Wall Street. The leading author is Jans Hagendorf. He's
Wolves of Wall Street. I think that's that's an easy.
I think they. Well, I've spoken to Jens about this because we're hoping to collaborate on some further research along those same lines. He's now at King's College London, and he's professor of finance. So that's where he is now. And so we'll be working together on that. But it's a fascinating study. And if you're looking for the study, be aware. The first one was 2016. There have been 2 other publications subsequent to that. And I'm sure there's more to come because there's such a vast amount of data there.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I see in the comments a lot of thank you, thank you, thank you. And people found this very useful. So thank you very much. Just a reminder to everyone, this replay will be available forever. It will be online, so you can always rewatch it and revisit some of the points. And I hope the message was very the message got across. There's a website, www.psy-key.com, where you can enter access code RAW 2022 and get your personal assessment, a kind of a high level executive summary version of the assessment. Use that, because that, I think, is a very important starting point that every single person in the risk profession needs to take. And more thank yous coming your way. So Jeff, thank you so much for speaking at the Risk Awareness Week, and we very much appreciate it.
Thank you, Alex, and thank you all for indulging me for this session. Thank you.